Welcome to the EO Media House podcast on AI. My name is Robert van der Zwart, member of EO Netherlands. My guest today is Avi Staiman. Avi is a member of EO Israel. He's the founder and CEO of Academic Language Experts, an author services company dedicated to assisting academic scholars to elevate their research for publication. And I'm curious how AI can support researchers in communicating their research findings. Avi, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Robert. Nice to be here.
Yeah. What does Academic Language Experts do exactly?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think I would, split the answer to this into two. I would call it, if we have the, AD and before and after. So before GPT and after GPT. So I would say before GPT, we were a traditional services business in the field of in a small little field known as author services. So this is a field that's dedicated to helping academic authors publish their research, academic scientists. There are millions of articles that are published every year. It's quite a robust industry, and there is a lot of support that's needed because researchers are inundated with different responsibilities, whether it's managerial or, advising their students or doing their own research, writing their research. So they oftentimes need support in that publication process, especially since there's a very high rejection rate. It's very hard to get an article published in a peer-reviewed journal or magazine. So we kind of come in to support them along that process, whether it's through language services or giving them content feedback on their research, helping them to format it according to the specifications of the specific journal. There's a lot of different things that authors need to do to get their research in a form that it can be published. And in the scientific world, that's what really gives it the stamp of approval, right? If you just have this finding and you kind of just put it up on a website, well, people say, well, how do I know it's true? Can I replicate it? Is anyone verified this? Has it been peer reviewed? So all these questions are really important questions. The only way to do that is to get it published by a scientific journal. That's a very long, difficult process that we help scholars along the way. So that's kind of classic. And I would say even looking towards the future, the goal remains the same. But the question becomes, what are the means to get there? And what we've started, thinking about and discussing is how can we use AI to kind of help researchers shorten that process, make it, less painful for them to get their articles published, and also help them, kind of maybe see angles that they wouldn't have before, or criticism of their research, and kind of anticipate that and be able to strengthen the research before it actually goes out to that peer review process.
So how long does it take normally to get your paper published? It's difficult to say, but...
It is difficult to say, but this has been studied. It really depends on the specific journal, but on average, from what I've seen, 6 months tends to be that may seem like a little bit of time, a lot of time, but I want everyone to think about like the pandemic, right? And let's say like you were the researcher who had been studying COVID for the last 3-4 years, and they turn to you and say, okay, it's up to you. You've got to publish, you've got to give us the figure out the formula for the vaccine and let everyone know about it. 6 months is a world of time, right? And we can't afford that. So some publishers were forced, especially those in the public health space, were forced to speed up their processes, made a lot of mistakes along the way. But I think it's kind of led to this understanding of, okay, well, the world doesn't work anymore where we wait 6 months. In fact, some studies can be outdated if you have to wait that long. So it's really critical to bring the time to publication down without, on the other hand, risking or sacrificing the quality review checks that need to be done, right? No one wants an article that's published in a week but is not, thoroughly reviewed, critiqued, and we, by the way, we saw this as well. There were studies that were published kind of as initial findings, during COVID that ended up being wrong and disproved. But a lot of people ended up, taking certain supplements or medications and, thinking that they could. This was actually, President Trump noted about that had already been disproven and talked about them as a solution for COVID. So the risks of publishing something that's not fully ready, reviewed, critiqued are also great. So it's finding that balance between time to publication in a reasonable way, but also making sure that we're not sacrificing on the quality along that process.
With how much time can you shorten the writing process to get to publishing by using AI?
Right, that's a really good question. So So there's a lot of steps along the way, along the workflow of getting an article published. And I think there are different bodies, companies, organizations that are set up to help at different parts along the way. So my company, Academic Language Experts, I would not say our core competency is how to get it published, right? There's a whole publishing industry. If anyone's ever heard of Elsevier or Wiley, Taylor and Francis, these are some of the big academic publishers alongside some of the university publishers like Harvard University Press and Cambridge University Press. They're working hard to try and speed up that process. What we're trying to do, this is really kind of, new and novel, is we're trying to speed up the writing process. So we're actually a lot more what I would say is B2C, right? Working, or in our industry, sometimes known as B2A, so business to author, right? We're trying to help the authors, the scientists, the researchers, the doctors. We know that their time is precious. We know that they don't love writing. We also know that they'd love to get back to the lab, right? And they and be working on the next experiment, or be, kind of doing further testing. And to sit there and kind of write up in the traditional sense their results is very constraining and time consuming. Until now, kind of, if you're very well funded, you may pay for a ghostwriter to come to do that for you, but that's a slow and inefficient and expensive process. If you're not well funded, you're kind of stuck out in the cold, and you have to figure it out. And even one more layer to this is that the vast majority of researchers are not native English speakers. The largest publishing country now currently is China. The U.S. used to be. They've fallen behind. There's a lot of research coming out of really the whole world. I mean, you can go through every country. In the Middle East, there's been a tremendous increase in publishing recently. So it's really important that we level the playing field and enable scholars the ability, for whom English is not their native language, the ability to really compete on a global scale. Because I think we would all agree that really what we care about is the quality of the research and helping people, and whether or not it's grammatically correct. It's important for research to be understood, but we shouldn't necessarily be wasting scholars' time with that. So we're trying to build a tool, a product that can really help authors not worry so much about exactly how they write or even what language they write in, but we can prompt them in certain ways using AI, give us the information that kind of came from their lab, which is obviously, confidential and unique to them and the novel outputs that they have come up with. And then we can kind of process that and turn it into the formula that creates an academic article. If we're able to do that, we see ourselves being able to take the time down from, anywhere between 25 to 50, 60 hours just to write up your paper, hopefully down. My real end goal is the 1 hour, but realistically within a year or two, to be able to, 2-3 hours, I think is realistic for scholars who are working in an organized way. And if we're really kind of trying to make best use of what is already out there and not making scholars kind of redo what they're doing every single time.
So how do you control the quality of the writing process and the quality of the content? And maybe an additional question to it is, what will be the place of the human editor?
First of all, I think there's a lot of the academic world has responded in a mixed way to ChatGPT, for example, because they take issue with two things. Number one is they take issue with the hallucinations and just the made up crap that GPT will produce, and that's a big problem in science, obviously. So to use it as a primary source is quite problematic. And the second issue is the sourcing, is the bibliography or citations. That's a big part of academic writing. You can't just make a claim and argue it and say, okay, I'm convinced. No, you actually have to you have to cite your sources, explain kind of what came before, explain what gap you're coming to fill, but it always needs to be rooted in the existing scientific conversation, which is sourced. So that's why if you've ever opened up an academic article, you'll see, at the end, there's a very long list of researchers. Now, GPT doesn't source, and when you ask it to source, sometimes it makes up, people that don't exist, or, sources that don't exist, and obviously that's very problematic as well. Well,
it's very convincing.
It's very convincing because
it can be very convincing.
100%. Sometimes the names are real, but the article isn't real. Sometimes the journal is real, but the article, there's a lot of, it's very problematic in that sense. In fact, I saw someone on Twitter a few days ago talk about how he got a review back on his own paper from a peer reviewer, from the process that it's supposed to go through. And the peer reviewer said, well, you haven't quoted the following sources. and he looked them up, and those sources literally did not exist. So the peer reviewer was instructing the author to insert sources that were fictional. And clearly they were using GPT to do their review. So anyway, it's very problematic. So how do you kind of up the... So my approach is that I think we need to be very cautious about using GPT as a primary source. It's kind of like if you were an academic and you would quote Wikipedia, people would say, well, that's not legitimate. And Wikipedia is a lot better sourced than GPT. So we need to be super careful. So for ideation, for idea creation, I think it's great, right? You can give a scientific claim, and then and say, well, GPT, give me 3 counterclaims, and what what are the flaws in mine? That's fantastic. Or to bring...
So it solves the writer's block.
It solves writer's block.
Cancel.
Say, here, I'm stuck on this. What are some ideas? 100%. It becomes very problematic when it becomes a source of verified information. That's the scary part about it, right? So that's why the reaction to it within the academic world has been mixed. So my approach is that actually let's start with the lab. So what I mean by that is let's start with the results from the tests and not start with GPT. Now, maybe when you're coming up with ideas for what research to do, you can use GPT. That's fine. But once you've done your study, I want to tease out from the researcher kind of what are the main conclusions, main results that are usually in either table form or a figure form that they have found, and then use GPT to build that scaffolding around it and to supplement. But 2 things. First of all, the primary research always needs to come from the lab or from wherever the scholar was doing their work. And then secondly, the author and the scientist, I'm using, by the way, scientists, author, researchers, simultaneous, they all mean the same thing in this context. And then they have to take responsibility to verify and to go through and to check and to make sure that everything is 100% right. So there is a responsibility and an onus on the author. On the one hand, it will very much shorten the time to publication, make their lives much easier. But that doesn't free them of the responsibility of taking ownership. One of the big issues, by the way, is a legal issue, right? It's like, let's say, I don't know, you're a pharma researcher. You put out some study based on, you use GPT. It wasn't verified. You didn't do your homework properly, and now all of a sudden there's this, big problem of, problematic drugs out there in the market. Well, someone needs to take responsibility for that, which is one of the big reasons that authors still are kind of have to be in charge of that process and say, I put my stamp of approval that even if I didn't write every word, I still am signing off on what's going on here. And that's a learning process.
So there should be a disclaimer, right? Or not?
It's more than just a disclaimer, meaning I'll tell you what the publishers have done until now and kind of my critique of them. What the publishers have done is they've added language to their terms and conditions. They've added terms to their policies on their websites to say, this is kind of what you need to do. And I think that's fine because that kind of frees them of their responsibility, but does it really kind of, I think there's a lot more education that needs to be done proactively about here are best practices for how to use these tools, as opposed to here are the punishments if you're kind of, if you get yourself into trouble by not doing it properly, right? It's got to be carrot and stick. There's got to be ramifications if you're not vetting your sources properly, but there also needs to be active education around kind of here's what you should use these AI tools for, and here's what you shouldn't. By the way, I've been mentioning GPT, but there's a slew of AI tools in the academic publishing space to find articles, to summarize articles, and all of those come with their upsides and downsides. So they all need to be, I wouldn't say regulated, because I think that's a hard thing to do, but they need to be educated, or, they need to be, best practices need to be really clear.
Well, it brings me to another issue. So shouldn't we use AI in the step before writing the process? So using AI to basically scrape academic libraries for the right literature and the right references and combine different literature resources and then start working on the research. So that can also save a lot of time in getting the experience done.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. The first issue is a legal issue, right? There is going to be some major litigation, and it's already started, between publishers, not just in the academic space, but in general, and these, and these AI scrapers, including GPT, right? Because it's like they are profiting off of others' work. Now, it's a bit more complicated because which work and how, and they don't source it, so it's kind of hard to know who should be, getting compensated for what, and if this is proper use or not proper use. So that's kind of the legal side that needs to be sorted out, and I assume that will get sorted out in the courts. In terms of the researcher, so again, you have to be careful that it's not that on the one hand, yes, 100% for brainstorming, for coming up with grant ideas, for, maybe finding research that you wouldn't have access to otherwise, yes, I'm a big fan, and I say, let's do it. The issue becomes when researchers, overly rely on the tool or on the tools. And let's say you're just using a summarizer. Well, the summarizer, if it does a good job, and we're assuming it does a good job, but maybe not. But let's say it does a good job, it will give you the bottom line of the research. But what does that mean long term for researchers if they're no longer reading, the maybe more boring method section, how I did my experiment, right? And they're just jumping to the conclusions. What do we lose in that growth and learning process? What that comes along with reading an academic article? And granted, I'll be the first one to tell you, those articles can be boring. They can be written in very high, language that people don't understand. There's a lot of issues with the way that research articles are currently written. But to then kind of turn it into just a, Cliff Notes version, for the same reason that I think, teachers don't love that in schools, right? Because it's like, well, there is a difference between reading Moby Dick and reading the, 500-word summary of Moby Dick. Like, the reason it is a literary classic is not because of the 500-word summary, right? So I think we have to be careful that, too many shortcuts can lead to laziness and can lead to poor research, which I think is going to have negative consequences.
On the other hand, if you feed in a complicated, difficult to read academic article into ChatGPT or any other tool, and you have it summarized in lay terms, does it make it more available and accessible to the general public? So academic research can be more part of everyday life or easier to comprehend?
100%, yeah. And that's a really good use case, which I think is really a critical one, which is, lay understandings of research, right? We're no longer in a world where you just kind of trust the doctor blindly no matter what he says. No, we want to understand what is our, if we have a diagnosis, what does that mean? What are the treatments? What are the possible, what's the experiment? What experiments are going on now? And there's no reason that, obviously it presents a challenge to kind of the classic authority that doctors have. And that's a question that we should be discussing. But it's also very empowering as a patient to be able to take control over your own situation. That's just one example, but I think you're 100% right. Being able to turn any study or any piece of research into something that's tangible, understandable by anyone is really important. That being said, are we going to have the same understanding in a deep, meaningful way of someone who can read the entire study and understand, well, how many patients were studied here as opposed to in other studies, and to what were the control variables, and what are some of the critiques? And I'll add something else is that, and this is something that pains me very much to say, but a lot of, we want to be able to trust that research is, verified and done properly and well, but research, the publishing industry is in a bit of a crisis right now. They're just last week, one of the major publishers, Wiley, their stock dropped by 25% after they had to retract hundreds of articles that were just bogus, and no good. So I'm not here. I'm a big believer in science, and I'm not here to poke holes. But I do think that we have to be careful before. And it's funny because I find myself being very conservative in this conversation with you, and in my industry, I find myself being pushing the AI tools. I guess it's all relative to kind of what your starting point is. But I think it can be very empowering, but it should not be the exclusive manner of how we, make decisions or do research for ourselves. I think we should always look for kind of complementary sources that confirm, maybe some of the decisions that we're going to take.
I also think that they're basically two target audience for academic writing. So academic writing purely for the academics, so peer-reviewed journals. But what I have experienced over the couple of decades, 25 years or so, that academics do have an issue with translating the data into good messages and good stories and make it more tangible for everybody, because it's a lot of public money is being spent on academic research, and it's so difficult for lays to understand what is being told and being said, and what we see with PhD researchers and postdocs is they have difficulties translating it to messaging and understandable what cause and effect and how we should interpret the data.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with you entirely, and I think that the pandemic really taught us that science. It taught me at the very least, right? I thought peer-reviewed science is something that's just kind of consensus, right? But I learned the hard way, especially with my American background. That's very much not the case. And there are a lot of science skeptics out there, and a lot more than I expected. Maybe they're just loud, disproportionately loud. It's possible, but it's not at all a given assumption that you are going to take, even basic scientific principles as fact. And I think one of the big reasons for that is because we've kept it so inaccessible from the mass audiences, and we haven't done a good enough job discussing it and communicating it. And all of a sudden, all these kind of public health officials who didn't have that much experience were up on center stage and having to explain complex concepts and themselves not knowing exactly what was going on. So, yes, 100%. I think the work that similar to the work that you're doing is critical and crucial. And I think it's in the end of the day, if the research community can embrace that and can understand the value of not only the theoretical research, but also the practical impact it's going to have on people. And like you said, this is taxpayers' money, right? So they have a right to see the return on their money. Then I think we'll all be better off for it, because when you have to explain something to someone, right? We all know this from our entrepreneurial backgrounds, right? It's like doing a pitch. You need to be able to explain it not just to someone who's kind of the industry expert, but, the elevator pitch, we all need that. And scientists are probably struggle with that maybe more than any other group of people.
Absolutely. So how do you envision the future in the use of AI in publication?
Yeah. Really good
in publicizing.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think the question that I don't yet have the answer to is, well, what happens when you can build out algorithms that can kind of, run and process the data themselves and come up and also cross-pollinate between different research, right? Like right now, the kind of classic traditional way that a research is undertaken is you have to do a literature review, and you try to read as much as you can in the field and see where, what has been studied, what hasn't. Well, what happens when AI can kind of do all that stuff, for you and learn new things from, kind of articles speaking to each other, so to speak, right? Or research. And then the kind of possibilities become infinite. But also what happens when you can create, so that's kind of what excites me. But as on the flip side, what are called paper mills. And paper mills, where this has been particularly prominent in China, these are basically, false papers that are totally made up, but they look, and they feel real, right? Because they're like, they can just kind of make up.
So convincing.
Sorry. It's scary.
They're so convincing.
They're so convincing. And there are, without getting into the boring kind of industry, there are business incentives now to promote quantity and to try and get as much out there. And the number one struggle happening in our industry right now, for those who are interested, is this kind of, how do we balance between the financial incentives of trying to get as much research out there as possible, and also let's open the doors to researchers around the world. There's no reason we should be, it's a global world and anyone can publish from their desktop on the one hand. On the other hand, how do we review and make sure that what we're getting is solid and real? And right now that's a very human kind of driven process. There's this peer review process where people will, look over other research, but the same way you can pass off writing as non-human, the question is, can you pass off AI research as real when it's not? And, being able to kind of vet that out is going to be the number one thing, because if we don't do that, just understand the ramifications, if we aren't successful, we basically lose what is fact in this world, what is truth. Because I think that, at least in my opinion, science is the closest we can come to saying, this is a fact, this is not, right? I'm going to get in this car because it has been scientifically, right, tested that it's not going to get out on me. The brakes are going to work, right? But what happens when we can't make those distinctions anymore? So anyway, I'm excited and petrified at the same time.
Avi, thank you for sharing your experience and your expertise with us. If you would like to know more about entrepreneurial and the work that we do within EO, go to the EO Media House podcast, wherever you get your podcast. And my name is Robert van der Zwart, and thank you for tuning in. And until next time, goodbye.